Carl and I are just back from London where we ran a couple days of framemaking workshops. And one of the really interesting and frankly, just a lot of fun moments that came out of the workshop with a group of key account managers was towards the end in a session we do on information overload and helping customers feel more confident in the decisions they're making in light of just massive amounts of information. As part of that, though, one of the things we got into and do get into is uh, customer learning styles or human learning styles when it comes to consuming information. And among many other dimensions, there's one that's particularly interesting from behavioral science or behavioral psychology, which is known as satisficing versus maximizing. So satisficing is someone who frankly is, in light of a lot of information is willing to just sort of pull up and shoot, as it were. This is they're looking to make a decision that is good enough. And so as a result, they kind of know when to stop, sometimes relatively early in a decision-making process, and they feel confident that they've got at least sufficient amount of information data input to make a decision, and they make the decision, they move forward. Maximizers, on the other hand, as opposed to satisficers, maximizers are never quite satisfied. They're always looking for one more piece of information, one more point of data. And I've done videos on this before, and there's more to come on this because this is such an interesting topic. So one of the things we do is a whole exercise on self-identification. Like things that are very simple, what we called low involvement decisions, like picking out a watermelon at the grocery store. And even there, it turns out that the room will split sort of right down the middle, where there's sort of half maximizers, half satisficers, but it's really on a continuum. And there's always one or two that are on way out on the ends of this spectrum. There's sort of this ruthless satisficer and this hopeless maximizer all in the same room. And it's so fascinating for them to come to terms with their own learning style because it's not something they've ever really fully thought of before. But once they're presented with this idea, it's like a light bulb goes on and they're like, oh, I totally get it. For what it's worth in the workshops, the reason why this turns out to be important is because when you engage in framing customers' thinking, helping or being able to identify whether someone has a tendency towards satisficing versus maximizing is important because sort of the remedy in terms of moving a deal forward for one versus the other is actually a little different. For a satisficer, someone is willing to kind of just settle, then in many ways, what's going to be important there is prompting them to think about things that they may have otherwise not thought about or otherwise overlooked, simply because they were sort of in a hurry to move forward. Versus someone who's a maximizer, the technique there that's really important is bounding. So prompting versus bounding, satisficing versus maximizing. Bounding, of course, is this idea of taking something that's big and hard and overwhelming and just helping your customer, your interlocutor, your partner in thought, put a frame, a boundary around it. So, leaving them degrees of freedom inside that frame so they can come to their own conclusions, of course. But nonetheless, helping them sort of, decide that enough is enough. And I feel confident in myself to make a decision within these boundaries. Here's what's kind of interesting. There's a number of things we could do across a series of videos around satisficing, maximizing, prompting, and bounding. But there's one just really quick hit idea that I think is super interesting, which is imagine you are talking to someone who has a tendency towards maximizing, someone who wants to learn, someone who feels the need to go look at more information, to study it more, to kind of determine sort of what's right. And so they're going to go do more research, more prompts in AI now in these days, I suppose. And maybe either you're a satisficer or maybe as a seller, you're just under pressure from the end of quarter, deadline or your manager's sort of urgency drivers. And you present a maximizer with a sort of end of year, end of quarter urgency driver. If hopefully most of us gotten past if we act now, my manager's authorized me to offer you a 15% discount, but we're still kind of at least, 1 foot in that sort of general universe sometimes of trying to create urgency drivers. And most of those urgency drivers are artificial urgency drivers around things that frankly aren't going to really help your customer involved in maximizing feel any better about the decision. In fact, it's a really interesting question to ask yourself. What happens when a maximizer feels trapped or forced into making a decision before they're ready? They're never going to feel particularly good about that decision. And so it raises and when you start looking at things through this lens of satisficing versus maximizing, you begin to actually then be able to identify customer behavior across that spectrum, something we've never really been trained to look at before in sales. Then you begin to understand when urgency drivers, frankly, are maybe aligned with customer buying, but sometimes in deep discord. Is that bad? And they're the antithesis of what customers want to do. And then I think it's really important to begin to think about this strategy of bounding versus urgency. It's not to say we can't help that customer make a decision quicker, but how we help our customer make that decision quicker turns out to really, really matter. Is it with false urgency, or is it with helpful framing, helpful coaching, helping them see that there are boundaries, that some things are more important than others, and help them based on social proof or other people like them see that there is an effective way to prioritize their thinking and make a decision that they feel good about. So the next time you've been asked or maybe decide it's a good idea to offer your customer an urgency driver, perhaps because it's the end of the quarter, ask yourself in particular, is it going to be helpful in general? And is it particularly going to be helpful if this person is a maximizer? Because I think in many ways it could actually go south in the moment, or certainly go south down the road.